The pen scratched against the paper in a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on the entire parking lot. Olivia Reynolds, standing in the pale October sunlight with a cluster of reporters gathered at her back, smiled with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing you have already won. She had just signed the final divorce papers on the hood of her pearl-white Mercedes, and every camera was aimed at her. Her voice carried clearly over the small crowd. Effective immediately, my husband Ethan is no longer part of this company. I spearheaded the restructuring myself. Today marks a new chapter for Reynolds Innovations and for me. The reporters applauded. A few employees who had been told to gather outside clapped nervously, afraid not to. The moment felt colossal, like a victory ceremony. But standing 10 paces away, near an unmarked black sedan, Ethan Reynolds did not flinch. He turned his head slightly toward the man beside him, his attorney, a quiet gray-haired figure in a navy suit who had not spoken a word publicly in 7 years, and Ethan said, in a voice so calm it was nearly a whisper, "Tell the board to begin the transfer." The attorney allowed the smallest smile to cross his face before replying, "Yes, Mr. Chairman." The 2 words landed like a stone dropping into still water. Nobody around them heard it. The reporters were too busy photographing Olivia's triumphant stance. The employees were too busy worrying about their jobs. And for 3 full seconds, the entire world kept spinning forward, completely unaware that the woman who had just fired her husband had made one catastrophic mistake: she had never checked who actually owned the company. Nobody in that parking lot realized that the real owner had just quietly signed the order that would undo everything she thought she had achieved. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would genuinely love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, pause with me for a moment and place yourself inside that scene. How would you feel if the person who had shared your bed for 16 years announced to the world that you were worthless to the business you built together? Imagine the sting of hearing your own name erased from the company letterhead while strangers applauded. What would you do if you held a secret so powerful that it could reverse the entire humiliation in an afternoon, but to reveal it too soon would be to lower yourself to their tactics? Ethan Reynolds had asked himself that question every night for 11 months. And his answer was always the same: he would wait. He would let the truth arrive in its own time, not because he was weak, but because he understood something that Olivia and her advisors had forgotten: true power does not need to announce itself. So why did he not argue? Why did he let the divorce happen without a single public objection? Why was his attorney smiling at the precise moment his wife believed she had torn his life apart? And the biggest question of all, the one that would keep you awake once you started pulling on this thread: who really owned Reynolds Innovations, and how had he kept it hidden from everyone, including his own wife, for nearly a decade? To understand what really happened, we have to go back 10 years. Ethan Reynolds met Olivia Carter in the summer of 2008, at a technology conference in Austin, Texas. He was 29 years old, a structural engineer with calloused hands from summers spent working construction with his father, a man who had built a modest home-building business from nothing and taught Ethan that a handshake meant more than any contract. Olivia was 27, sharp and magnetic, the kind of woman who walked into a room and recalibrated the energy. She was pursuing an MBA while working for a commercial real estate firm, and she could talk about market trends, capitalization rates, and growth strategies with a fluency that left Ethan quietly impressed. They fell in love quickly, the way people do when they see in each other complementary strengths. Ethan would design and build, Olivia would strategize and sell. Within 2 years, they married in a small ceremony at his father's ranch, with wildflowers lining the aisle and the smell of hay and cedar in the air. His father, Charles Reynolds, a widower with a weathered face and gentle eyes, pulled Ethan aside that evening and said, "You found a sharp one. Just remember, son, never confuse the loudest person in the room with the strongest." Ethan tucked those words away, not knowing that they would become the axis on which his entire future would turn. Olivia's mother, Diane, welcomed Ethan with genuine warmth in those early days. She would host Sunday dinners, insist on taking family photographs, and frequently tell Ethan that he was the best thing that had ever happened to her daughter. Diane was a retired high school principal, observant and articulate, and she seemed to admire Ethan's quiet work ethic. When the young couple decided to found Reynolds Innovations in 2012, a company that would eventually specialize in modular sustainable housing, Diane even co-signed their initial office lease and told her bridge club that her daughter and son-in-law were going to change the face of affordable housing. The first 2 years were brutal. Ethan worked nights and weekends, often sleeping on a cot in the back of their cramped office. He mortgaged the small house his father had left him, skipped vacations his friends took to the coast, and poured every dollar back into prototypes and patents. Olivia traveled constantly, meeting investors, pitching to developers, and slowly building a reputation as a charismatic negotiator. They were a team, or so it seemed, and the business began to grow. By 2015, Reynolds Innovations had secured 3 major contracts with municipal governments, and the company needed a clear public-facing leader. Olivia argued that she should be named CEO, pointing out that Ethan's strengths lay in design and operations, not in boardroom politics. She was right, and Ethan knew it. He trusted her completely, so he agreed. Legal documents were drawn up to formalize her management role. Ethan retained the title of Chief Technical Officer, and he poured himself into the work he loved, believing that his wife would steer the ship with honor. For a while, she did. The company thrived. They moved into a beautiful craftsman home. They hosted dinners for investors. Diane continued to be a constant presence, often stopping by to help with their daughter, Lily, who was born in 2016. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Reynolds family was a portrait of modern success. But if you had been watching very closely, the way a careful person watches ice begin to shift on a frozen lake, you might have noticed tiny warning signs. Olivia started interrupting Ethan during meetings. She began making decisions about project budgets without consulting him. She started referring to the company as my team and my strategy. Small cracks, easy to dismiss, but they were there. The real change began in the spring of 2018, when Olivia attended an executive leadership retreat in Scottsdale. She returned with a new vocabulary, words like optimizing assets and trimming legacy weight, and a new financial advisor named Gerald whom she had met at the conference. Ethan noticed that she began closing her laptop whenever he walked into the room. Her phone, which had always lain casually on the kitchen counter, now never left her hand. Then came the private dinners with lawyers whose names she did not share. Then the passwords to their shared cloud storage were changed. Ethan asked about it one night, standing in the hallway with his daughter's laughter echoing from the bathtub upstairs, and Olivia looked at him with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes and said, "Just some compliance streamlining. Nothing you need to worry about." He chose to trust her because that is what men like Ethan do, they trust until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. But in the quiet hours, he could feel something shifting beneath the floorboards of their life, a low frequency that told him to pay attention. So he began to pay attention. 6 months before the scene in the parking lot, Olivia secretly filed for divorce. She had retained a prominent corporate attorney named Strickland, a man known for structuring separations that left one party with almost nothing. The filing was strategic and hidden. She used a separate mailing address and scheduled court dates when she knew Ethan would be traveling to project sites. She had spent months quietly restructuring board loyalties, identifying which directors would side with her when the moment came. She believed she was invisible in her maneuvers. But what Olivia did not know was that Ethan had received a phone call the very night she submitted the first documents, from a young clerk in the family court office who had once worked as an intern at Reynolds Innovations and remembered Ethan's kindness. The clerk said, "Mr. Reynolds, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but you should check your mailbox at the old property." Ethan stood motionless in his workshop, sawdust clinging to his boots, and he realized in that instant that the woman he had loved was no longer his partner, she was his adversary, and she was moving against him with a cold precision that made his stomach tighten. He did not confront her. He did not rage. He simply walked back inside, kissed his sleeping daughter's forehead, and began to make his own preparations. To understand what Ethan did next, you first have to understand what he had already done years earlier, not out of mistrust, but out of a quiet man's instinct to protect what mattered most. When Reynolds Innovations Incorporated, Ethan had worked with his father's attorney, a man named Harold Webb, to structure the company in a way that separated legal control from day-to-day management. Ethan owned the majority of voting shares. But what nobody realized, not even Olivia during all those years of her rise, was that he had never transferred those shares to the marital estate. They were held in a revocable trust established by his father before his death, a trust that explicitly designated Ethan as the sole beneficiary with full voting rights that could not be diluted without his written consent. The trust documents were stored in a safety deposit box that Ethan visited once every 6 months, always alone. He had done this not because he anticipated betrayal, but because his father had drilled into him a single principle: build your foundation deeper than anyone expects, son. You don't dig deep because you fear a flood, you dig deep so that when a flood comes, you don't have to panic. And so while Olivia climbed the public ladder of power, believing she was ascending to total control, she was actually standing on a platform Ethan had quietly built and legally retained. She was the face. He was the foundation. And foundations do not move. In the months after learning about the divorce filing, Ethan did something extraordinary. He did not call a lawyer to fight the divorce. He did not hold an emergency press conference. Instead, he began to document everything. He saved emails, preserved financial records, and calmly traced the path of company funds that were being redirected into Olivia's personal accounts. He gathered evidence not to destroy her, but to ensure that when the truth came forward, it would be undeniable and complete. He watched his wife rehearse her victory speech in the mirror, and he felt something crack open inside him, not hatred, but a deep, mournful understanding that the woman he had married had grown into someone who measured love by leverage. His daughter Lily would ask him why Mommy was away so often, and he would simply say, "Mommy is working hard, sweetheart," and then he would build model bridges with her on the living room floor, their small hands aligning popsicle sticks, while his mind calculated how many days were left before the storm would break. The morning of the firing, Olivia had arranged everything to maximize his humiliation. Security guards were instructed to clear his office. His name was removed from the employee directory before breakfast. An all-staff email went out at 8:47 a.m., announcing a mandatory meeting in the parking lot at noon. Ethan arrived in his truck, dressed in a simple flannel shirt and jeans, because he had known what was coming and he had decided that he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him in a suit, pretending to be something he was not. His attorney sat in the sedan, engine off, watching. When Olivia handed him the termination letter in front of 53 employees, her voice was crisp, "Ethan, your role is dissolved. Your security access has been revoked. You will have no further involvement with the company I now lead." The board members, hand-picked by her over the past 2 years, nodded approvingly. Ethan did not raise his voice. He took the letter, folded it once, and said, "I understand." Those 2 words, so simple, so stripped of resistance, left Olivia momentarily confused. She had expected anger, perhaps desperation. But this was something else entirely, and it unsettled her far more than any outburst could have. She recovered quickly, turning to the crowd to receive their applause. Ethan walked to his truck, opened the door, and sat there for a long moment, looking at the building his father's lessons had helped him build. He remembered the smell of his father's workshop, the old leather chair in the corner, and the framed photograph of his parents on their wedding day that now sat in a box on the passenger seat. He had retrieved it that morning from his office, knowing it would be the last thing he would take. Then he drove away. The reporters, thrilled with the drama, peppered Olivia with questions about the company's future, completely missing the story that was already in motion just a few hundred yards away, where a man in a sedan was dialing a number that would set off a chain of events none of them could reverse. If you are still watching, let us know where you are watching from, or simply comment, "I'm still here." I would love to know who has been following this story all the way. Because what happens next redefines everything you think you know about power. That afternoon, Olivia held a press conference in the company atrium. She stood beneath a large banner that read, "Reynolds Innovations, a new era," and described the firing as a necessary strategic realignment. She spoke about removing operational drag and unlocking shareholder value. She smiled for the cameras and accepted congratulatory calls from 3 investors who believed they had backed the winning horse. Inside the building, employees whispered about which department might be next. Some felt a pang of sympathy for Ethan, but fear kept them silent. The board released a statement praising Olivia's leadership and confirming that the transition had been executed smoothly. For about 6 hours, the narrative she had crafted held perfectly. But what none of them realized, what Olivia could not have known, was that the company could not legally remove Ethan Reynolds, because Ethan Reynolds was not just an employee or a co-founder. He was the controlling shareholder. Not on paper that Olivia's lawyers had been allowed to review, but in the deepest structural layer of the corporate charter, the one that had been drafted by Harold Webb 8 years earlier with a provision that most modern companies would never include, a supermajority voting right tied to a single trust, a right that could be triggered only by a direct petition from the trustee. And that afternoon, from a quiet conference room in a law firm 3 towns away, the petition had been filed. To truly grasp the magnitude of this reversal, you need to understand how carefully Ethan had hidden his ownership. He had never once mentioned the trust to Olivia, not because he was deceptive by nature, but because his father had taught him that a gift left unannounced is a gift that cannot be weaponized. The trust had been established when the company was worth less than $200,000. Over the years, as the company grew to a valuation of $43 million, Olivia assumed, incorrectly, that all corporate assets were shared marital property. Her attorneys had even reviewed the company's operating agreement, never noticing that the document contained a deliberate ambiguity. The ownership schedule referenced an attached exhibit that was maintained separately and confidentially. It was the legal equivalent of a door hidden behind a bookcase, and unless you knew to reach for a specific volume on a particular shelf, you would walk past it 1,000 times and never suspect it existed. Ethan had built his entire life around the ethic that the strongest thing a man can do is to be unshakable without being cruel. And now, without raising his voice, without a single public accusation, he was about to pull that quiet leverage. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. the following Tuesday. The official agenda, circulated by Olivia's administrative team, was titled Post-Restructuring Governance Review. She assumed it would be a formality, a chance for the board to officially ratify her position as chair and CEO with full executive authority, shedding the last vestiges of Ethan's operational involvement. She arrived early, wearing a navy blazer and a strand of pearls her mother had given her when she got her first promotion, and she took her seat at the head of the oval mahogany table with the practiced ease of someone who believed the room belonged to her. 11 board members sat around the table, all people she had either recruited or won over in private conversations. Coffee was poured. Phones were silenced. And then the door opened, and Harold Webb walked in, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Behind him came Ethan, dressed in a simple gray sweater, looking as though he had just come from dropping his daughter off at school. Olivia's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second, before she steadied it. "Ethan, this meeting is for board members only," she said. Harold Webb, without waiting to be introduced, placed a set of documents on the table and said, "Actually, Olivia, Mr. Reynolds is the only person here with the authority to call this meeting. He is the majority shareholder. He has always been the majority shareholder." The sentence hung in the air like a bell tone that no one knew how to answer. What followed was the slow and total unraveling of every assumption Olivia had built her power upon. Harold Webb distributed copies of the trust agreement, the original articles of incorporation, and a notarized declaration that had been updated every year, affirming Ethan's 74% voting stake. The board members passed the papers among themselves in stunned silence. You could hear the soft shuffle of pages, the creak of leather chairs, and the distant hum of the HVAC system. One board member, a man named Donald who had been one of Olivia's earliest allies, removed his glasses and rubbed his temples with the look of someone who had just discovered he had bet on the wrong horse and was rapidly recalculating his future. Olivia's face had gone pale, but her jaw remained tight. She did not cry. Instead, she turned to her own attorney, who was sitting in the corner with a laptop, and whispered something urgent. But Strickland's expression told her what she had already begun to realize: the legal ground beneath her had evaporated. The board was obligated to recognize the controlling interest, which meant that every decision made in the past 48 hours, the firing, the structural changes, the press releases, could be reversed with a single vote. And Ethan was the only vote that mattered. Harold Webb then explained, in a measured tone that carried the weight of 4 decades in corporate law, that Ethan's ownership had been structured in this manner precisely to protect the company from hostile takeovers, including from within. He read aloud from a letter Ethan had written to the trust 7 years prior, a letter that had been kept sealed. "I want this company to serve the employees and the communities we build for, not any single ego. If I am ever removed without cause, or if any attempt is made to dilute my stewardship, the trust shall be invoked to preserve the founding vision. This is not about me. This is about protecting the work from those who would forget why it began." The board listened, and one by one, they began to shift their posture. It was not loyalty to Ethan that moved them, it was the sudden, sobering recognition of legal reality. If they sided with Olivia, they would be exposed to breach of fiduciary duty claims. If they sided with Ethan, they would be aligning with the rightful owner. The arithmetic was brutal and simple, and in corporate boardrooms, arithmetic always wins. Olivia sat motionless, staring at the documents in front of her. The pearls around her neck suddenly looked heavy, like a chain. You could see in her eyes the replay of 10,000 small moments, the times Ethan had said, "I trust you to handle it," the times she had mistaken his quietness for passivity, the times she had assumed that the man building prototypes in a dusty workshop could never be the one holding the architectural plan for the whole enterprise. She had spent years climbing a ladder she thought she owned, only to discover in the space of a 20-minute meeting that the ladder had always been someone else's property, and that the person holding it had never once used it to threaten her, until she had forced his hand. The room waited. The chairman, a gray-haired man named Wallace who had served on the board since 2014, cleared his throat and asked the decisive question, "Mr. Reynolds, what would you like us to do?" Ethan looked around the table, not with triumph, but with a weariness that suggested this was the last place he wanted to be. He said, "I want a vote of no confidence in the current CEO, and I want all termination actions reversed immediately. But I am not here to humiliate anyone. I am here to restore the company to its mission." The vote was taken, and it was unanimous, with 3 abstentions from members who covered their eyes with their hands as if the light had become too bright to bear. The board meeting adjourned at 9:12 a.m., and by 9:45 a.m. company-wide email went out from Harold Webb's office, stating that a routine governance review had clarified the ownership structure, that Ethan Reynolds remained the majority owner, and that all recent personnel changes had been rescinded. The email did not mention Olivia's name. It did not need to. Employees who had watched her triumph in the parking lot 48 hours earlier stood at their desks reading the message with mouths slightly open, trying to reconcile the image of the man they had seen quietly walking away with the reality that he had just quietly walked back into absolute authority. There are moments in corporate life when the truth moves faster than rumor, and this was one of them. The entire building seemed to hold its breath. Olivia gathered her belongings, a leather folio, a silver pen, the pearls she would later place in a drawer at home and not wear again for a long time, and walked out of the building through a side exit. Nobody stopped her. Nobody cheered. The silence that accompanied her departure was, in its own way, the most devastating sound she had ever endured. Ethan did not watch her go. He had spent the previous night sitting on the back porch of the Craftsman house, now empty of her presence, listening to the wind move through the old oak trees his father had once said reminded him of patience. He had asked himself whether the victory was hollow, whether reclaiming a company built on trust that had been shattered was a form of winning or a form of grieving. He had looked at a small photograph he kept in his wallet, a faded picture of his father standing outside the ranch house, and he had remembered the man's voice saying, "Son, you will be tested by the people you love most. When that happens, do not strike back. Just hold the line. The truth doesn't need revenge to be true." And so when Ethan walked back into the Reynolds Innovations headquarters at 10:30 that morning, he did not enter through the main lobby with a flourish. He used the side door near the engineering bay, the same entrance he had used for 10 years, and he walked past the cubicles where people he had known since the company's infancy now looked up at him with uncertain expressions. He nodded at a few, said, "Good morning," to the receptionist who had always saved him the sports section from the newspaper, and then he made his way to the office that had been his long before it had been anyone else's. On his desk, left untouched by the security team because perhaps even they had sensed something was not right, sat the framed photograph of his father that he had taken home on the day of the firing. He picked it up and looked at it for a long moment, the glass cool against his fingertips. His father had died in 2014, just as the company was beginning to find its footing, and Ethan had never fully grieved the loss of the man who had taught him how to measure twice and cut once, how to read a person's character by the way they treated waitstaff, and how to hold on to the quiet center of yourself when the world became loud. Standing in that office, with the morning light coming through the window and the distant sound of the manufacturing floor humming with life, Ethan allowed himself one private moment of ache. Not for what he had lost, the marriage had become a performance long before the parking lot, but for the woman he had married, the idealistic young professional who had once stayed up late with him folding pamphlets for their first trade show, and who had somehow, step by unseen step, become a stranger willing to erase him from his own life. He did not feel victorious. He felt resolved, and perhaps a little sad, but mostly he felt a deep, quiet gratitude that his father's wisdom had outlasted the storm. He sat down in the old leather chair that still had a small tear on the left armrest where a soldering iron had slipped in 2013, and he composed a brief message to the entire company. It read, "This company was built by many hands, not just mine. The work we do matters because it gives families homes, and homes are where hope starts. I am not here to settle scores. I am here to get back to work. If you are willing, let's build something that lasts." And then, because he was still the man who had skipped vacations and mortgaged his father's house for a dream, he walked down to the prototyping lab, rolled up his sleeves, and began reviewing the latest sustainable housing modules with 2 young engineers who had been too intimidated to speak during the previous administration's meetings. The energy in the building began to shift. Employees who had been bracing for a wave of retaliation instead found themselves in the presence of a leader who carried his authority lightly, who asked about their families, who remembered the name of the custodian who had worked there since the second year. It was not a perfect restoration, because some relationships had been frayed beyond immediate repair, but it was an authentic one, and authenticity in the wake of betrayal is a rare and healing force. So here is where we leave this story, not with a courtroom drama or a vindictive dismissal, but with a man sitting alone at his desk, looking at a photograph of his father, and smiling not because he won, but because he never lost who he was. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong. It is refusing to become like them while proving the truth. Ethan did not seek a second chapter defined by punishment. He did not parade his ownership or demand apologies. He simply reclaimed the responsibility that had always been his, and he returned to the work that gave his life meaning. The lesson, if there is one to carry with you, is that the strongest foundations are often invisible, laid in moments of quiet integrity when nobody is watching. So I want to ask you now, the person watching this, do you think Olivia deserved a second chance, or was reclaiming the company the only choice Ethan could make? And if you had been standing in that parking lot, watching your own name stripped away by someone you loved, would you have had the patience to wait for the truth to arrive in its own time? Let me know in the comments. I read as many as I can. If this story kept you thinking until the very end, you will want to see the next one on the channel. It has an even bigger twist, and it explores another hidden truth that changed everything for a family just like this one. Click that video next. And if you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe for more emotional, high-stakes stories with unforgettable endings. Thank you for being here.